China in turmoil. Today's topic is Burning Africa, a collapsing Chinese dream. Unprecedented anti-China demonstrations and violence are spreading across the African continent. Chinese-owned factories are being attacked, construction sites are in flames, and the Beijing government has begun an emergency evacuation. In Angola, Tanzania, Kenya, and South Africa, anger towards China is exploding across the entire region. It started with a small-scale labor dispute at a single textile factory in Angola. A video of Chinese management beating local workers went viral on social media. The anger spread in an instant, and protest demonstrations escalated into riots. Black smoke rose, warehouses were engulfed in flames, and people fled in panic. This did not stay confined to one factory. In Tanzania, port facilities were attacked, and in Kenya, the offices of Chinese companies were set on fire. In South Africa, a large-scale protest by labor unions erupted. The flames spreading across all of Africa have dealt a direct blow to China's massive investment strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative. For the past 20 years, China has poured tens of trillions of yen worth of funds into Africa. Roads, railways, ports, power plants, the majority were built with Chinese capital. Angola, in particular, was a country called a success story of the Belt and Road. Shielded by abundant resources, Chinese companies took control of oil, mines, and infrastructure, and tens of thousands of workers were dispatched. On the surface, it was a win-win relationship, but the reality was different. Long hours, low wages, and a lack of safety measures. Opportunities did not go to local workers. The majority of management positions were held by teams dispatched from mainland China. Still, many people endured it, to feed their families, to send their children to school. But the accumulated dissatisfaction exploded suddenly one day. We are not slaves. Crowds began attacking Chinese companies one after another. Factory walls were covered in graffiti saying, "Give Africa back," and "China, go home." The police tried to suppress it, but the flames of anger did not die out. The next day, Angola's capital, Luanda, looked like a battlefield. Charred buildings, destroyed malls, the remains of goods scattered in the streets. The chaos spread to neighboring countries. In Tanzania, protesters blockading a port stopped freight trains. In Kenya, a Chinese company's office went up in flames. In Johannesburg, South Africa, labor unions held a rally saying, "We will not tolerate slave labor by Chinese companies," and tens of thousands gathered. A faction that turned into a mob attacked Chinese-owned warehouses, clashed with security guards, and injuries occurred. In response to this situation, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued an emergency statement. It demanded that African nations prioritize the safety of Chinese residents above all else, and began dispatching charter planes. At the same time, it announced it would dispatch naval vessels to nearby waters to support the evacuation of its citizens. State-run media broadcasted daily images of Chinese families evacuating. It emphasized the point that Chinese people were victims and made no mention whatsoever of the labor problems or environmental destruction that were the facts behind it. But the people of Africa understand. They know for whom their land, rivers, and forests were destroyed. A female activist in Nairobi said, "We do not want to fight with China. We just want fair compensation." These words symbolize the true feelings of Africa right now. The development method of being drowning in debt, which continued for many years, has finally met with bankruptcy. The governments of African nations had roads and railways built for them, but in exchange, their debts to China exploded. Many countries became unable to pay, surrendering rights to their resources and ports. Aid had domination. Now, that distorted relationship has gone up in flames. The fire in Angola is spreading as if to burn away years of pent-up resentment. Still, the Chinese government remains silent, insisting it is an outrage by a portion of local extremists. But behind the scenes, Chinese embassies in various locations have successively declared states of emergency. Africa is now truly greeting a second independence movement. It is not an armed struggle, but a liberation from economic servitude. Development for whom? That question is shaking the African continent. The impact of the riots is hitting the entire economy directly. At Kenya's Mombasa port, cargo ships are backed up, and the supply of goods is paralyzed. In Tanzania, logistics warehouses have been burned to the ground, and the markets in the capital, Dar es Salaam, are marked by empty shelves. At Angola's mines, Chinese engineers have evacuated, and production is at a complete standstill. All that remains are ruins and lost workplaces. The people of Africa are crying out. This is not a riot. It is a holy war. On social media, the hashtag Africa for Africans is spreading. Videos of the protests get millions of views in just a few hours, and young people from other countries are also expressing solidarity. The words "Burning Africa" are decorating news headlines. At its core is the unbalanced partnership between China and Africa. China's state-owned enterprises, in exchange for building infrastructure, have obtained rights to land and resources. In that process, the voices of local residents and consideration for the environment have been almost non-existent. Villages are sunk to the bottom of dams, forests are cleared, and fishing villages are turned into ports. Under the name of development, many people have lost their way of life. Still, the governments turn a blind eye. Why? Because many of them are in a state of being drowning in debt to China. If financing from China stops, their national budgets will fall into dysfunction. That is precisely why this structure, where governments, Beijing the intentions more than those of their own citizens, is nurturing anger across all of Africa. Now, that anger has passed the boiling point. In Nairobi, Kenya, young people tear down the signs of Chinese companies and shout, "Give us back our freedom." In South Africa, labor unions severely criticize it as a return of colonialism. The Chinese government refutes this, saying, "It's a misunderstanding. We are supporting Africa's development." But the answer on the ground is different. It is not support, it is domination. The gaze of the international community is also now coldly turning toward China. The US and EU nations view China's influence as a problem. On the other hand, Russia welcomes it as a sign of African self-reliance. As international interests intertwine, the Beijing government cannot hide its impatience. Even within the Chinese Communist Party, a review of the Africa strategy has surfaced as a topic of discussion. However, what they fear is not a humanitarian crisis, but the burning of their investments. A Beijing? The riots in Africa mean the bankruptcy of our economic model. Domination through development has finally met its end. The raging flames have turned not only the economic foundations, but also human relationships of trust to ash. The image of Chinese equals exploiters is beginning to take root. Even Chinese workers who were working diligently on the ground are now becoming targets of attack. On the Chinese mainland, censorship is being strengthened, and Africa situation has become a banned search term. State-run media broadcasts praising overseas expansion, making people turn their eyes away from reality. But the world is watching. The factories burning on African streets, the workers fleeing in panic, the wailing children. This footage can no longer be hidden by anyone, and many people have begun to wonder, did China change Africa, or did it destroy it? Now, the dignity of Africa is being thrust at Beijing, and these flames show no sign of being extinguished. The chaos in Africa has finally begun to directly hit the Chinese economy itself. As an export destination for China, Africa was an important market. However, the majority of that trade has now stopped. In Nairobi, Kenya, containers are piled up at the port, and trade worth hundreds of billions of yen is in a frozen state. At trading companies in Shanghai and Guangzhou, export cancellations are coming in one after another. The Africa business, which was a symbol of the Belt and Road, is now turning into a burden on the Chinese economy. the renminbi is falling, and criticism is erupting on China's domestic social media, saying, "Are we wasting money on Africa again?" Africa, once a symbol of aid, has now become a symbol of burden. The upper echelon of the Chinese Communist Party is considering a re-education program on the ground. The aim is to calm anti-China sentiment. However, in many countries, hostility towards Chinese workers has already increased, and it is unlikely to be effective. China pretends to support Africa, but is actually dominating it. These words have now become the slogan for Africa's youth. Meanwhile, within China, press regulations are enforced, and state-run media reports that the anti-China demonstrations have been successfully suppressed. But in reality, riots are continuing in many places, and the number of evacuees has swelled to tens of thousands. At evacuation centers, water and food are in short supply, and Chinese families are spending the night on airport floors. In front of the Chinese embassy, there are lines of protesters saying, "Increase the flights home." Still, the Beijing government continues to maintain its silence, explaining diplomatically that this is a temporary problem. However, no one is taking those words at face value. This is not just a demonstration. It is a movement to break away from economic dependence on China. But China will not withdraw easily. Africa is a treasure trove of strategic resources. Lithium, cobalt, gold, rare earths. Many of C are essential resources for the future semiconductor industry and EV manufacturing. There is no way Beijing will let go of these. That is precisely why they have offered additional loans and reconstruction support to maintain their influence in Africa. However, the atmosphere on the ground is cold. It's not support, it's a buyout. Africa's youth no longer have expectations for the dream presented by China. The right to raise their voice, which they have grasped once, they have no intention of letting it go. Protest posts on social media are endless. Protect our ports, return our land, give our children a future. This is no longer a protest against a specific company. It is the voice of the African people themselves. And this movement is also beginning to spread to Asia. In countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which are struggling with loans from the Belt and Road, anti-China demonstrations are also occurring frequently. The slogan "Common Development" that China championed is now being ridiculed as common collapse. The flames burning in Africa are burning up China's diplomatic strategy itself, and that fire has not yet weakened. Beijing is now being forced to make a heavy choice. Will it rebuild its relationship with Africa, or will it suppress it with force? Whichever path it chooses, a system of domination like the one before is impossible. The people of Africa have learned how to stand up. They no longer hesitate to raise their voices and say no. That is also the long-standing wish of those who know the old colonial era. What is independence? Whose development is it? Africa is now once again questioning the meaning of these things. On the other hand, within China, many opinions view this situation as unexpected. Officials believed Africa is a friendly nation. Anti-China sentiment is impossible. But they overlooked something. That true friendship is not built with money, but with trust. Africa's uprising is not merely a disturbance in one region. It is a reaction to the distortion of the international order that China itself has built. Debt-ridden dependence, domination by infrastructure, and aid that compels silence, all of that is now being questioned. China's foreign exchange reserves are decreasing, and its domestic economy is also suffering from a real estate recession. Africa's backlash, occurring in this context, can be seen as proof that the world has begun to move away from China. China, having lost the momentum it had when it was called the factory of the world, is now becoming isolated. China's state-run media controls the news, emphasizing that the local chaos has subsided. However, satellite images still show factories burning and crowds of protesters. The facts cannot be hidden. The gaze of the international community is no longer. not only at Africa but also at China itself, to break the vicious cycle of violence and provide transparent aid. And the world is beginning to realize how fragile the new colonialism called economic aid truly was. A future walking together, which China once advocated. Those beautiful words no longer reach anyone's heart. And the people of Africa have quietly declared, we will no longer live someone else's dream. We will live our own dream. That is the message that the Africa of 2025 is sending to the world. Well then, we'll see you next time on China in Turmoil. Thank you for watching.